Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 18th, 2020, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And this week, we're going to be chatting with an author who I've had on the show several times in the past about his newest book. It's absolutely fascinating. But before we dive into that, I want to thank those of you who continue to support Talk Nerdy. Remember, there are a lot of ways to keep Talk Nerdy afloat. I do sell ads for the show, but in addition to that, you can purchase merchandise that directly goes to support the show at talknerdymerch.com. You can also, rate and review the show on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, anywhere that you listen to podcasts if they have a rating function or a reviewing function. And of course, you can share the love on social media. That's a huge, huge help. But financially, if you're in a position and you want to pledge your support, the best way to do so is to visit patreon.com/talknerdy, and you can learn more there. This week's top supporters include Avril Kulbita, Michael Goucher, Christopher Pitts, Mary Neva, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Dudas Infinitas, Brian Holden, Daniel Lang, and of course, David J. E. Smith. Thank you all so very much. All right. So I've had Dr. Mario Livio on the show before, and we were talking about previous books like Brilliant Blunders from Darwin to Einstein, Colossal Mistakes by great scientists that changed our understanding of life and the universe. We've also talked about the book that came next, Why? What Makes Us Curious? But this week we're talking about his newest book, Galileo and the Science Deniers. And this book is so relevant right now, you guys. It's so, prescient. I don't even know if prescient is the right word because it's been going on for so long. But this beautiful biography of Galileo from, a world-renowned astrophysicist is also matched, I think, in the depth of the storytelling with how relevant it is right now. Living in a world of individuals who denied science, there's a lot of parallels we're seeing from everything from the coronavirus pandemic response within the United States to, continuing vaccine denial and climate denial. And I could go on. And we do in the episode. So, I think we should just dive right into it because it's a great interview. And I think you're going to absolutely love the book. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Mario Livio. Well, Mario, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So I know it's a tough time for a new book to be coming out because of, how upside down the world is right now. But luckily, there are podcasts out there and there are different forums for you to be able to talk about this new book. And of course, people can still buy books. And now is kind of the best time to read because a lot of people are in lockdown in their houses.
Yeah, you would have thought so, right? But a few people tell me that they are actually finding it hard to focus and having a hard time actually reading or doing anything meaningful. People are basically frustrated of being, stuck at home.
It makes sense, and depending on where you live in the country or in the world, you might find that the weather is a little bit more accommodating. So going outside on the deck or the patio or taking a nature walk, sitting down with a book can be really, really nice. But some people don't really have that luxury. I'll tell you, I've been reading a lot more since we've been in lockdown. What about you?
I've been relatively busy with this book, which is coming out next week.
Mm-hmm.
So, trying to arrange for all the events that have been canceled in person and things like that. And, for interviews and writing some short pieces and things of that nature.
And that's really tough, right? Because kind of we were saying offline, a lot of the authors that had books coming out in March, April, May, June of this year are finding that all of their in-person events have been canceled and they're having to kind of move everything to an online format, similar to how students around the globe are having to go to school online, and people around the globe who have the capability, who are in that kind of privileged position to be able to work from home, are having to make those kinds of transitions as well. Are you solely working on promotion around the book? Have you started writing? You write so prolifically, by the way. You're like, there's always a new book. So do you have the next one in the
Well, I started thinking about the next one. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's good. So I know that I had you on the show for Brilliant Blunders, which I just love the concept and the topic of that book, because it really was all about the way that science works and how science is a series of mistakes, and learning from those mistakes has been instrumental to kind of moving our understanding forward. I'm not sure if I had you on the show for what makes us curious, but I think I did. I think you might have been on my show twice now. So this is exciting to have you back for your newest book, and it's called Galileo and the Science Deniers. So I want to know, what is it about Galileo that made you decide, okay, yes, you've written a few books. I'm going to count here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 books so far, about, generally speaking, physics and math. But why is it you haven't yet written a book specifically about a single person? What was it about Galileo that grabbed you enough that you figured you could dedicate all of these pages to him and to the people who were sort of in his orbit? No pun intended.
Yes, right. Well, Galileo, you see, I'm an astrophysicist by profession, and Galileo can, rightfully be considered the founder of modern astronomy and astrophysics. So from that side, I've always been interested in him. He was a fascinating person. Now, in addition, of course, he represents all kinds of things that were always very dear to me, intellectual freedom, fighting against science deniers and things of that nature. And in addition to that, in addition to him being a fascinating person and having so many sides to his personality, it struck me how relevant his fight against science denial becomes for today, where we encounter science denial on so many fronts and related to so many topics. I mean, it's enough to mention, climate change. We have encountered this now, with the initial response to this COVID-19 pandemic. We see it sometimes in the attempts to put creationist ideas side by side in science lessons, at school. So there are all those of people who, object to vaccinating their children and things of that nature. So all of these made me think, it's really time to talk about Galileo and his battles.
Absolutely. I mean, did you ever anticipate while you were writing this? And of course, you were very dialed into sort of the current state of affairs with regards to science denial, especially on a large scale, on a political stage. But did you ever expect that such an egregious lack of science literacy would be on such dangerous display within at least America, if not in other parts of the world as well? But I mean, our commander-in-chief has to kind of take the cake for the embarrassing kind of daily briefings that he's been making that just fly in the face of science to the entire nation, if not the world.
Yeah, you see, I must say, I finished the book before the current pandemic started. Mm-hmm. So, I was more focused on, on things. Well, the book is really a biography of Galileo, of course, but I was focused in terms of its relevance for today on things, in particular, things like climate change, things like, vaccination of children, things of that nature, which are dangerous in themselves. Because, you see, think about something like climate change. Is one thing to deny science when, maybe it doesn't affect so much your everyday life or, life on Earth. But to bet against science when actually the really fate, if you like, of life on Earth is at stake is insane.
Yeah.
And that was true in the case already of climate change. And then came this thing, with a pandemic. And this was not in the book because, I finished the book before it started, but this just made it, even more urgent, if you like, to pay attention to this, because this is something that really dwarfs the other things that happened before.
Absolutely. I mean, in a way, it's so much more tangible. Like when I think climate change, as obvious it is to you and me, and I think most of the people listening to this show, how incredibly broad and vast and important mitigating or, trying at least to prevent some of these issues are. With a pandemic, it's so in your face, it's so concrete, and just to like stare it in the face and say bizarre things like maybe we can inject, cleansers, or maybe we can shine a light inside the body. Like it's just bananas, the extent of science denial.
Yeah, but even before this thing, I mean, this injection of detergent into your body or UV light, things like this, of course, has to take the first prize on the science denial. But I'm talking even in the very early stages of the pandemic, when there were declarations like, well, there are now 15 cases. In a few days, this is going to be down to 0.
Yeah.
And now we're talking 55,000 dead. And close to 1 million people infected, just in the U.S. Alone. So this is just incredible. I mean, it truly is. If somebody told me that this would be happening, I wouldn't believe it. I would say, oh no, this is already too much.
Right. No, it's true. And the idea that it's, in some ways continuing to get worse, I think it just reinforces how important a book like yours, but not just this book. I think a lot of your writing over the years has really grappled with this issue, which is that science denial is not a new problem, and it just kind of has its own flavor each new generation. Like as the culture shifts and changes, the way that science denial sort of like shows its ugly head, shifts ever so slightly.
You're right. You're absolutely right. You see, in Galileo's case, of course, the main reason for the denial had to do with literal interpretations of scripture. Yes. I mean, it is often described as if it was a fight between science and religion, but Galileo never saw it as such. He was not against religion. He was a religious person like everybody else at the time when he lived, in the 17th century. It was just literal interpretations of scripture. And Galileo's point was very clear. He said, listen, the Bible is not a science book. The Bible is never wrong, but it was written for our salvation. And the proof is that they don't even name the planets in the Bible. So you shouldn't take it literally. And when there is a conflict between what observations, experiments, and reasoning tell you and what is written in Scripture, it means you didn't understand the meaning of Scripture and you should reinterpret. So that was the main reason then. If you look at climate change today, for example, and people who talk against it, yes, some of them have a religious motivation, but that's actually the small part. The main reason for objection has to do with some sort of political conservatism, some sort of, economic ideas, things of that nature.
Yeah.
When you talk about the pandemic, the current pandemic, I don't even know, to be honest, what is the reason to deny science. I mean, this is, an epidemic here. People are dying. You should listen to the scientists and what they tell you what to do.
It's true. It kind of seems like obviously time is going to tell. And once we have more data and can look back at this like strange social experiment with hindsight, we'll better understand. But it does seem like some of the same forces are at play. Obviously, there is a political influence here. There's definitely this like strange distortion of the truth that says that if the economy gets back quicker, that in the grand scheme of things, the net will be a positive, although we have good evidence to show that if we stay locked down longer, the economy will actually bounce back better. So even that is like not a solid argument. And I think some of it just has to do with the narcissism of the leadership. And I can only imagine that that was also the case in Galileo's day and in other times when science denial was so prevalent, is that there are simply people in charge who are narcissists, who think that they know best and who want to go down in history for having been the decision makers, regardless of whether that decision was based in evidence.
You're right. I mean, it's especially control of power and things of that nature. I mean, you say narcissism, and that has to do with personalities, but also, just to keep control and to be totally in power. One thing that I like to say is that what the church did to Galileo would have been wrong, even if he had been totally wrong in all of his theories. Let's suppose he was completely wrong and it was really the sun that was going around the earth. The church still should not have controlled, Galileo, put him on trial and condemn him.
Yeah.
But so it's a matter of control. It's a matter of, keeping the power to do things because they want to do them. And that happened in Galileo's time, and it happens now. Of course, we happen to be also in an election year, which complicates things further.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely true. So I think it would maybe be interesting and important to go back a little bit and to start talking about, the things that you learned as you were kind of compiling this biography of Galileo and some of those parallels. I think for a lot of us, we know the name Galileo. Maybe we know about the Galilean moons of Jupiter. We know that he was an astronomer. We know kind of a very thin story about the fact that he was viewed as a heretic and that, kind of what you said before, like, oh, he's anti-church, or the church didn't see him as being respectful of its views. And so because of that, they saw his kind of scientific nature as heretical. But I don't even know, A, how much of that is true, and B, how thin of an understanding of him as a man that really is.
Yeah. So, if you want, I can tell you in just a few sentences, the story here.
Yeah.
So Galileo was really in many ways, he was the founder of modern science, because before him, there was not this concept that science is based on experimentation, observation, and reasoning. And certainly not the concept that science is also based on mathematics. And Galileo introduced all of that. He started doing experiments. And it was difficult to do experiments at the time. You see, suppose he wanted to study free fall of objects, but objects were falling very fast, and he didn't have good enough devices to measure short times. Mm-hmm. So he couldn't quite follow that. So he came up with this genius idea of using inclined planes. And in fact, inclined planes that were lifted by a tiny, tiny bit so that he slowed down the motion of balls rolling down the plane. He almost like diluted gravity, if you like, because he understood that he still can travel. You can look at it as an extreme case of free fall. If you just look at the vertical motion of the object. Mm-hmm. So he started doing that, experiments. Then when it came, for example, to astronomy, of course, he built his own telescopes. He didn't invent the telescope, but very quickly he managed to build telescopes that, gave him a 20 power or more. And he, instead of observing, his neighbors with that telescope, he started observing the heavens. and there, he discovered all these things. He saw the moon, and because he had this incredible also artistic training. He knew how to draw. He learned how to draw. He learned how to use shadow and light. He understood what he saw. he saw those features on the moon and immediately understood, oh boy, this means that the surface of the moon is really rugged. There are mountains, there are craters, there are this. So he did that. Then, he observed sunspots, for example. Mm-hmm. So again, people before him saw sunspots, but he really observed them. He saw how they were moving. From that, he determined that the spots were really on the surface of the sun. He determined that the sun rotates about its axis in a little bit less than a month, things like that. So everything that he did was based on experiments, observations, and then reasoning from those things. So he really changed the entire methodology of science. He introduced what we now call the scientific method. And that is really something incredible. In addition, he had this idea that the universe is written in the language of mathematics. Mm-hmm. This was something that to this very day, I cannot understand how he came to that conclusion. Because you see, there were no laws of physics written as mathematical laws at the time. He formulated the very first few that were like that. And yet he had this incredible strong intuition that that's how it should be. So he did all of that. Okay, now, what he did, he, of course, supported the Copernican view, which was heliocentric. The sun is at the center, the earth is moving, and the other planets move around the sun. This was against the church's orthodoxy. They adopted Ptolemy's old idea that it's the earth at the center, because that also fit with their general concept that, humans are the peak of creation and so and so. And so earth, of course, had to be at the center. So he did that. Once he did that, this contradicted with literal interpretation of scriptures. In particular, they liked to cite that paragraph from the book of Joshua, where Joshua commands the sun to stand still, which seemed to imply that before that the sun was moving and not the earth. So they didn't like that. That's where, we had the conflict. That mm-hmm. conflict eventually led to a trial. In the trial, he was found vehemently suspected of heresy, forced to recant, and really give up everything he believed in on his knees, and then, sentenced to house arrest for the last 8.5 years of his life. So that's the story. But it's an incredible story. Now, along the way, Galileo was not the nicest person around. I mean, he was incredibly smart, but he didn't like people disagreeing with him. And he didn't like to sit silent either.
Gotcha. Interesting. I didn't know that about him. So he was not well liked?
Well, he was liked by a few of his closest friends. He had good close friends. But boy, if anybody disagreed with him, was he sharp in criticizing those. And I must say, not even always when he was right. I mean, there were cases when he was wrong, and he still criticized these people.
So did he, obviously being kind of a father of modern science and the scientific method, I have to assume that science was just done differently in his day. Did he have sort of institutional support? Did he build his own laboratory? How did kind of the function of science exist at the time?
Yes, so he actually did build his own workshop. He actually took that idea from, in Venice, there was this thing, was the arsenal, where they used to build ships and all kinds of equipment. So he built his own workshop and hired his own person who lived in his home and, built things for him. So, for example, he built his own telescopes. And he built a number of other things, like he built a compass that was a little bit like a calculator, and he actually made some money out of that. He tried to sell some things as well. So that's how he did his things. Mm-hmm. Around him, there started to be at the time people who were doing experiments, but I remind you, in ancient Greece, where, some of the greatest minds existed, Aristotle, Plato, and so on, they never believed in experiments. They thought that to understand how nature works, you just have to sit down and think about it. There is a story that Aristotle, for example, thought that women don't even have the same number of teeth as men. And he was married. Aristotle was married. And
he
it never occurred to him to count in his wife's mouth.
Amazing. Oh, man. And so Galileo, of course, was like, well, why don't we just look and write things down and see if, there's consistency and if there's patterns. Was just that action in and of itself heretical? Or was it really specific to any findings that he would have that were in conflict with like biblical law or with, literal translations of the Bible?
Yeah, well, there were things that were not heretical in the sense of being against the Bible, but they were still considered, rather unorthodox, and people didn't believe it. In particular, the use of the telescope. See, what Galileo was arguing is that what he saw with the telescope was, a representation of reality. And those people were saying, but wait a second, you're using this device. Who tells me that what you see there, it's not some artifacts that, are created by the telescope itself? He had a lot of that at the beginning, against him. But that part actually got settled when the Jesuit astronomers of the Collegio Romano in Rome, which was the main school of mathematicians and scientists, they also confirmed his observations. So that part, he did get over that the telescope, is a bona fide thing of seeing reality. But there was still the issue of interpretation. And it's in the interpretation that always the problem, used to arise. Because, for example, the Pope Urban VIII, who at the end, is the one who put him on trial and all that. What the Pope was saying, look, maybe you see things and you interpret them this way, but, that's not really reality. That is just, you are coming up with theories to sort of explain the appearances. But this doesn't mean that reality is this way. And more than that, the Pope was on the opinion that since God is almighty, God can do things in a million different ways, most of them, even incomprehensible to human beings. So to claim that reality is in a particular way would be in a way to restrict God's ability to do things any way he or she likes. And as a result, the Pope was on the opinion that we will never actually know how things are. We will just know what saves the appearances.
Huh. And so, you mentioned that, with certain observations, like when he was first spotting things in the telescope and people were saying maybe that's an artifact, that he had this kind of, I don't know what you would call it, but maybe institutional support, like these other groups of people who had status with kind of the religious majority were saying, no, we looked too, and we agree that what he's seeing is what he's actually seeing. Was that common for him, or was that actually a very rare situation, that kind of external support for his findings?
That actually, slowly developed. At the beginning, he had people who even refused to look through the telescope because, they from the beginning, decided they are not going to believe what you see through there. And also, to be honest, the very first telescopes, including the one he built, were not that good. So there were even situations where people looked through the telescope. He tried to show them, let's say, the 4 satellites of Jupiter, and they didn't see them. They simply didn't see them, even when they looked through the telescope. So uh, at the beginning it was very hard, but once those others started seeing the same things, then at least that party got over. But then there was the question of how do you interpret the results?
Yeah. And is that where you really did start to see a transition? I mean, I guess my question is, during his lifespan and during his life's work, um, was it a gradual distancing from sort of the support and the light of the religious authorities, or was it kind of a quick shift, and then he was constantly trying to, like, I don't know, work his way back into accepting or acceptability? Or did he say, screw it, I don't care what you think, this is truth, and I'm just going to keep pushing louder and harder?
I'm afraid that given his personality, he most of his life basically said, screw it, I'm just going to push harder. But he did try. You see, this book, the dialogue, on which at the end he was brought to trial, he did accept advice, well, not only advice, at some level also instructions, you see, he had to ask for imprimatur. To print a book, he had to get permission to print it. And the permission came from the church. Mm-hmm. And so the person who was in charge of that basically told him, look, you're not going to get that permission if you leave the book as it is, because the book more or less mocked all the old ideas, or the geocentric ideas where the earth is the center, and just spoke very loudly about, heliocentrism, even though Galileo produced it in a form of a, discussion between three people, and claimed that, he just voiced all the different opinions. But it was very clear to anyone who read the book what his opinion was. Mm. And so by those instructions, he added a preface and he added some sort of a conclusion, in both of which he adopted the language he heard from the Pope, which basically said, but in fact, we can never know because God can do things any way God wants, and so on. So he did add these things, thinking that would actually, save the book. The problem is that it didn't quite save him, because it still remained true that anybody who read the book more or less saw that those things were kind of afterthoughts. And also, he put the words of the Pope, maybe not intentionally, but it so happened that he put the words of the Pope in the mouth of Simplicio, which was the sort of a simpleton in the discussion, who basically was mocked throughout the entire book. So that didn't gain him too much support among the Jesuits.
Interesting. It kind of, in some ways, parallels these modern conversations that we have about science and the value and the importance of science communication. And sort of like, it's not enough to just have an idea, but having the kind of a diplomatic understanding of how to get your ideas across to sometimes a hostile, or sometimes just an unwilling or an uninterested, or maybe, just an audience that's not ready to hear these things because they really in so many ways break their paradigms. That doing good science communication, as you know, is a skill in and of itself. And it sounds like maybe Galileo wasn't the best science communicator.
Well, let me tell you, I mean, in some ways he was the best, and in some he wasn't. Let me tell you in what he was, for example. So you see, all the scientists of his time were publishing everything in Latin. By publishing in Latin, that immediately made their works accessible only to some, very high elite in the society. Mm-hmm. Galileo insisted on publishing most of his writings in Italian, so that everybody will be able to read it.
Right.
He also engaged in an incredible outreach campaign by actually asking the Tuscan court to fund the manufacturing of a large number of telescopes and for those to be sent all across Europe to all kinds of people of influence. So he wanted to make his science known to everybody. Where he wasn't a good, well, not communicator, but not a good diplomat, really, was in that he was extraordinarily stubborn. And he was a zealot. He was a zealot for science. And he even thought that he can convince the church that the church is making a mistake by not adopting Copernicanism, because, he thought, listen, at one point you will be shown to be wrong. And so, it's better for you to understand that now. But the thing is, he never did this in a very mild way. And he was always very convinced of his, righteousness. And that part didn't help him.
Right. All right, guys, let's get back to the show. In a way, kind of an understanding that if I can reach out to the masses in a non-elitist way, then more and more people might be able to see the world the way that I see it. But the diplomacy was missing. But my question is, at that time, how many people were truly literate? Like, how many people could actually understand his writings?
I don't know in numbers or anything, but certainly by writing in Italians, people understood him. I mean, his first book, well, it only printed 550 copies, but it was a bestseller. They sold in no time, like hotcakes. And later. His later books also did, go far across Europe. At one point, I think one could say that he was the best known scientist in Europe.
Oh, wow. So he really had that. It wasn't one of those situations where people didn't really discover his work until after he was gone. He was like rocking and rolling the whole time he was actively doing science.
He was. Yes, he was.
Oh, yes. Fascinating. Gosh, it's so funny how we know of him, but we know so little about him. I guess there's so many important, actors in the history of certain scientific fields that I think for some people who haven't, dedicated their lives to studying within those fields, my background is not in astrophysics at all. And I think probably a lot of people listening could very easily say, I do not have a PhD in astrophysics. It's interesting that we kind of muddle all these people up, or we don't really see them as people. We see them more as like a name in text or I don't know, it's like a proper noun, but not a person.
You're absolutely right. And that actually is one other reason why I wrote this book, because I realized, that as fascinated as I have always been with this person, I mean, like I say, he's not only one of the greatest scientists to have ever lived, but also, the fighter for intellectual freedom. I realized that very few people, I mean, most people heard of Galileo, but very few people actually really know much about him. I tried this even with my personal friends, many of whom are scientists. Well, not astronomers, but, in other areas of science. And I said, Galileo, yes, Galileo, and say, yeah, remind me what exactly he did.
Right.
and things like that. So, and partly this has to do with the fact that most biographies of Galileo were written by Galileo scholars, which meant that they were extremely well researched and very often very well written, but not that accessible because they all contain sometimes too many details, and they deal with some topics that people don't find that interesting or attractive.
Historians, when they write, oftentimes I find that it's a bit drudgery, because I think what you said, it hits the nail on the head. There's too many details because they've done so much work doing research that there's all these little extra things that they need to, oh, and this was the same time when this person was here doing this, and then this happened, and let me give you the date over and over and over. And you're like, this is very hard to read. Whereas the storytelling sometimes gets missing in all of that.
Right. So, this is why I decided to write, a relatively short biography, but which I did my best to keep it as accurate as possible. And I was extremely happy when Michele Camerota, who is one of the really greatest Galileo scholars living, to whom I sent an early copy of the book, told me, congratulated me on how accurate the book was. So I thought, that's very nice to hear it from him, that even though the book is shorter, and has somewhat different points, he thought it was still accurate. So I'm very happy about that part.
And so when we think about Galileo in the sort of context of history, his life and his contributions were taking place, what would you say? It was like kind of right at the shift between sort of medieval thinking and Enlightenment, right? He was like right on that precipice.
Right. Well, he was sort of in, what you might call now late Renaissance, So he was not at the beginning of the Renaissance. He was in late Renaissance. But what is true is that even in late Renaissance, the general thinking of most people in Europe was still kind of medieval in a way. So you're right. So he really introduced these new things and this revolution in thinking.
Right, because he was kind of doing his work sort of from I guess he was born in the mid 1500s and died in the mid 1600s. So he was doing his work somewhere in between. I'm just Googling him as we're talking, and he lived to be 77. That seems old for the time.
Yes, and it is especially surprising because he was sick from about age 40. He was constantly sick. It's not as if, he was a very healthy person and therefore he lived to an old age. No, he was constantly sick. He was very often bedridden and couldn't do anything. And he had all kinds of trouble. In the last 4 years of his life, he was even blind in both eyes. So it's a bit strange that he lived to 77 when he really suffered from all these rheumatic pains and other things and so on.
You know what else is interesting is I found a table because I always like to try and contextualize in my mind. I found a table online of estimates of the world population at different years. And around the year 1600, which would be like halfway through his life, it's estimated that there were only 545 to 579 million people on the entire planet. So, it's interesting because I think about, nobody was literate and blah, blah, blah. But there also were just so many fewer people at the time. So I'm sure there was a great disconnect between rich and poor, between educated and not educated, between elite and, and lacking or needing. But the community was probably very small. Like when somebody wrote about science, other scientists probably read their work.
Yeah, of course. And Galileo himself communicated with a number of important scientists. For example, Johann Kepler, the famous astronomer. They wrote to each other all the time. He wrote to other people, Diodati, mathematicians. Sarpi was in Italy, and a few others. He had a number of friends who were known scientists, and he communicated with them.
To kind of think about that timeline too. So he was a contemporary of Kepler, but he was a little bit before Newton, right?
Yes, he was before Newton. Yes, but interesting. Somebody told me, and this is right. I mean, a sentence which I believe is right, that both Kepler and even Newton were to some extent also mystics. They were great scientists, but they were also mystics. Kepler at some point, thought about Earth like an animal and things like that and so on. And Newton, he did all his things with alchemy and other things and things like that. Mm-hmm. And Galileo, who was, at the same time with Kepler, but before Newton, was in many ways a modern person. He really was not a mystic at all. He was really, in his thinking, he was really a modern person.
Right. So the magic or the supernatural stuff was missing. And although he was religious, my guess is he was always trying to square religion with his scientific understandings of the universe.
Right. He thought that there is no conflict really, and there really shouldn't be any conflict as long as you don't, allow literal interpretations to color what you think about the world. I mean, so yeah.
I like that. I think that that's important too from kind of a secular perspective, which, I'm an atheist, I'm a secular thinker, but I don't think that religion is fundamentally wrong or bad or misguided. I think the problem where the conflicts come in for me personally from a philosophical perspective is exactly what you said. When somebody says, no, but Earth is 6,000 years old, and you say, no, but it's not. Like, we have all of this evidence to show you that you're wrong, and you're just believing that in spite of it.
Exactly. When you put in, when you try to dispute testable facts, that's when, when there is a problem. But as long as you don't do that, then there should be no conflict, because they operate in completely parallel, universes almost. I hate to use the word. Yes.
Right. And that's in many ways what Galileo did, is that he said, okay, I know that you guys all think that things happen this way because we've been reading about it for so long, but I actually can show you that they're happening in this other way. Let me show you my calculations and my observations. And people were like, no, don't want to read that. I mean, in some ways, it's paralleled by Darwin so many years later, where he was reluctant, right? Like Quammen famously wrote, The Reluctant Mr. Darwin. He took so long to publish, and he was really worried about the backlash because he started out as a very religious person as well, and realizing that, some of the things that I say are actually in direct conflict to these teachings. How is that going to be received?
Exactly right. And in many ways, Galileo and Darwin, did something similar in the sense of, demoting the earth or life, or human life, from being central to all of creation.
Right. And I mean, I guess it's pretty easy to see, even in 2020, how that could feel very threatening to some people who have developed an entire paradigm around it. I mean, the fact that there are still people today who hold on very tightly to these purely fundamentalist views, these views that are blatantly been debunked. But there's still a kind of holdover group of people who just dismiss science whole cloth and say, no, the Bible says it, so that's what I'm going to believe. It goes to show you how much more difficult it would have been hundreds of years ago when the evidence was new.
Yes. Look, there was a Gallup poll in the US which showed that 30-some% of the population still think that humans were created in their current form at some point less than 10,000 years ago.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. I mean, and the thing is, it doesn't really surprise me. And maybe it's because I read these kinds of polls a lot, and because of the type of work that you and I do, we're exposed to that kind of thinking regularly. But it really does make you have to kind of ask the question, which is the fact that this was a problem hundreds of years ago, and it persists perniciously to this day, even though the evidence is so much stronger now. The evidence is so much cleaner. It's almost, well, it is, I think, undeniable, like that somebody can look at an image of Earth from space and then still say that the Earth is flat. Like, these are the problems that we're dealing with. What do you do? What have we learned?
Even not from space. I mean, I've seen recently images taken from the top of Mount Everest, which show the curvature of the Earth.
Yeah. You don't have to go far. I mean, I guess that is far, but it's still on this planet. Like,
yes.
And that there will just be conspiratorial thinking that's developed over and over to try and reason away or, again, square that circle. I mean,
but you see, the thing that still puzzles me, and maybe it shouldn't puzzle me since I see this again and again, and also this is partly why I decided to write this book. But you see, in Galileo's case, for example, Pope John Paul II already declared officially that Galileo was right and the church was wrong.
Huh.
So, so this is already, the highest authority in the Catholic world declared that. He said Galileo was right and the theologians were wrong by doing these literal interpretations of scripture.
Yeah.
So what more do you need?
Well, and that's the thing that I think, going back to the very beginning of this conversation, the important point that you made, that really, ultimately, a lot of these issues aren't fundamentally religious issues, but they've been co-opted by a sort of conspiratorial political motivation that is often not passive, but instead really constructed. Like the anti-climate change rhetoric, it really doesn't have to do with people feeling like they don't have much control over nature and that they're playing God. I think there's some of that, but a lot of it has to do with being duped, like actually being marketed to and being given an agenda that it favors certain interests.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
What do we do with that? I mean, in a way, you can say that even when in Galileo's time, there was a machine, right? Because politics and religion were indiscriminate at the time. Like these were theocracies. And so, the church made the rules. And now we're supposed to be living in a secular society, but some of those same issues persist.
Yes, even though driven, by other motivations and other things, political, economical, and others. But yes, you're absolutely right. And the thing, you see, the thing that is a bit not a bit, it's quite a bit frustrating, is the fact that there are many studies which show that if you take people who are convinced of something, let's say they are convinced that humans don't cause climate change, let's say, then it doesn't matter how much evidence you're going to show them. This will not convince them. People are not convinced by empirical evidence. So what that means, I think, is that the only way to try to change minds over the long run is to really concentrate on education at schools. This is the only way. Because once already those opinions are formed, it's apparently very, very difficult, if not impossible, to change them.
Right. And that's really what I think Dunning-Kruger said so beautifully when the Dunning-Kruger effect was first developed and published. And it's, barring all of the specifics of what it means to think that you have insight or skills or knowledge into something when you don't, really it was founded on this concept that the mind is not a blank, empty vessel. Like, we're not just talking about depositing information into nothingness. Oftentimes you're talking about changing a mind that already has made its mind up. And so it's full of misinformation already. It's full of emotional experiences. And that's a much taller order. But as you said, if we can develop an educational system or improve an educational system that promotes critical thinking and logic and reason in children, then there's less kind of brainwashing that you have to undo, and it allows for global change. But at the individual level, it's hard to say this because I think that it makes me sound a bit cynical, but I often say when I'm talking to my colleagues on the Skeptic's Guide, like, why are you working so hard at that one person trying to whittle away when you know that you're probably never going to get through to them? Like, it's not about a campaign to change individual minds, but it's what you're talking about, this kind of global or generational shift. And in a way, we've seen it. It feels like we haven't, but we know that people are more educated than they used to be. We know that people are more literate than they used to be.
Oh, there is no question about that. And look, I mean, even that number which I quoted to you about, that Gallup poll, about people believing it, the percentage that was found for people doing that in the US was actually the smallest it has ever been.
Right. So even though it seems like extreme,
it is still 30-some%, which sounds crazy.
Yeah.
But it is still the smallest it has ever been.
So we're trending in the right direction, and so much of that has to do with
right. And by the way, in Europe, that percentage is way smaller. For some reason, that's a sort of a US type thing. Yeah.
Yeah, the religiosity, we do have an interesting kind of bipartisan religious fundamentalist movement here that you don't see as often. I mean, there are obviously parts of Europe, but you're right. There is this kind of like very weirdly patriotic American right-wing alt-right kind of movement that that does feel quintessentially USA.
Well, of course, you do find it, I must say, in the fundamentalist parts of other religions as well, of course, in Judaism and Islam and so on.
Sure, yeah. And you're right. It seems to be, it's less about religiosity and it's more about this fundamentalist view, this kind of unchanging, unwavering. And in some ways, that's what I think hardcore conservatism, there's a reason that you see these parallels, and it's because the definition of conservatism as opposed to progressivism is that, like, if it's not broken, don't fix it. I don't want to iterate and change and progress towards an understanding of the world that maybe is more relevant to the people that live in it now. I want to keep things the way they've always been. And that is a recipe for disaster. I mean, it's fundamentally anti-science.
Yes, it's I will repeat what I said before. When the future of life on Earth is at stake, as it is in the case of a pandemic or in the case of climate change, to bet against science is really insane.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't say it better myself. And that's what's happening right now. I mean, luckily, there are still sane people all across the globe. And luckily, the World Health Organization is doing what they can, even if we pull funding. And luckily, most established nations that we're seeing are wisening up. And as of the time we're recording this, I did read today that after the really bizarre comments about shining light inside of your body or cleaning out your lungs with disinfectant that Trump made, I just read this morning that he didn't do any briefings over the weekend, and he's decided that they, quote, aren't worth his time anymore, which I'm hoping means that somebody got to him and said, you can't do this anymore, like you're going to kill people. And that's his way to save face. So maybe we'll see some changes there. But, oh, God, it would be more comedic if it wasn't so tragic. It's just right on that cusp right now.
You're right. If it weren't as sad as it is, it would have been funny, but it really is sad.
It really is sad. And it's just, a new example of a long line of examples. These are extraordinary circumstances. And so we're seeing what happens with inept and anti-science leadership in these extraordinary circumstances. A random question just came to me, and I'm sorry, it's like taking a little bit of a left turn, but was there something for you personally in your kind of relationship as an astrophysicist, but also as an Italian born? You were born in Italy, right?
No, I wasn't actually.
Oh.
My name is extraordinarily Italian, but my family only about 4 generations back on my father's side comes from Italy.
Oh, gotcha. So did you grow up in the States?
No, I actually grew up I grew up in Israel.
Okay.
I was born in Romania. My family was a Jewish family, and like many Jewish families, traveled a lot, not for pleasure, but because of historical circumstances. So, so I was born in Romania, lived there for only 5 years, grew up in Israel, and came to the U.S. permanently. I mean, I came many times before that, but permanently, let's see, it would be now almost 30 years ago.
Oh, right. And so your accent is an Israeli accent. Is that where you culturally would kind of identify with most?
I suppose. I mean, my accent is not the typical Israeli accent.
That's why I couldn't place it.
Yeah, but I do have an accent. I mean, I feel a little bit like, this actress Gal Gadot.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, she's an Israeli, yes, or ex-Israeli, and she once hosted Saturday Night Live. And she started the program by saying, I know I have an accent. I'm not from here. I'm from Albuquerque. And then she said, no, I'm from Israel. So I say I have maybe Gal Gadot's accent.
I love that. And I guess the reason that came up is because if multiple generations back, right, because of your Italian name, and I have one too, Santa Maria, if there was any sort of, or has ever been any sort of personal pull towards Galileo because of that shared ancestry, because of course, oftentimes when we think of great thinkers, yes, we think of Roman thinkers, but we often think of Greek thinkers, we think of British thinkers, we think of, obviously people from all over the world, but there is kind of a special Enlightenment or Renaissance movement that is particular to Italy that I think resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah, that's right. And I happen to be also a great art lover. If we were doing this with pictures and not just sound, you would have seen that behind me there are some hundreds of books on art. So, of course, Italy plays a big role in that.
Absolutely. Oh, well, gosh, Mario, I've learned so much already from you. I'm wondering, before we close and do the final two questions, if there is anything that we didn't really touch on, maybe from the book or from, your recent work, or even just things that have been on your mind lately with this strange turn of events globally. Is there anything you want to discuss that we haven't really, dipped our toe into?
No, I think we discussed everything. I just, want to, if I have to summarize everything in one sentence, I would say believe in science.
Right.
And it's not that science cannot be wrong. Science, is many times wrong, of course. Science even accepts the idea that all science and all theories in science are provisional. Namely, they hold true until something better is found, or until there is a fact that contradicts what we thought until now. But this is exactly the beauty of science, that it self-corrects. Sometimes the self-correction happens very fast. Sometimes it takes decades or maybe even centuries. Newton's theories were fantastic, and we managed to go to the moon using more or less Newton's theories. But when you move very fast, or you are in strong gravitational fields, you start to need to correct that by Einstein's general relativity, and so on. But the amazing thing is that at the end of the day, the GPS system in our own cellular phone uses both Einstein's special relativity and general relativity, which are two theories that you might have thought that surely they have nothing to do with your everyday life. And yet they do. So really believe in science. This is the message. I hope people will like the book, not just because of that, but because of the fascinating person that Galileo is. But if there is one message, it's that.
Absolutely. And so before we go, I would love to, get your take. And I know that I've had you on the show now a few times, so I'm interested to see where your head is at now. But I'd love to close with the same two questions that I always ask my guests at the end of the show, if you're good with that.
Please, yes. I don't remember what the questions
Perfect.
are, but hopefully I will know how to answer.
Well, and of course, they're incredibly relevant to the book that you've most recently written, and of course, a lot of your writing in the past and your work as an astrophysicist. So here we go. I would like to know if when you look into the future, in whatever context is relevant to you today. So this could be cosmological, it could be global societal, or it could even be, something a little more personal. the first question is, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night? The thing that you're most concerned about, maybe even a bit pessimistic about? And on the flip side of that, where is your optimism coming into play? Like, what are you genuinely looking forward to?
Yeah, these are interesting questions, and I cannot say that I've given them a lot of thought recently, but I have, of course, over the years, and including while writing this book. What keeps me up at night? What keeps me up at night? Well, I think things that keep me up at night do not necessarily have to do with science. I'm, for example, extraordinarily worried about inequality. I see inequality as a huge problem, and I think it manifests itself in ways that it's hard even to predict. You see, every time where you have a border between two regions of the world where there is an incredible disparity in conditions, and that can be in the border between the US and Central America, or it can be in the Mediterranean where it separates Europe from Africa, for example, and places like this. Every time you have such a situation, that cannot be a stable situation. It just cannot be in the long run. And I think that is a huge danger for humanity. And, I hope that people will do something about this. There are some people who try to do. I mean, Bill Gates is a good example where, he puts so much effort into trying to improve conditions in Africa and so on. But it is really, that's one thing that I really worry about.
Right.
Things that make me optimistic. I don't know about if optimistic is the correct word, but when I worked as an astrophysicist, I thought that there are a few things that I would like to see happening during my lifetime. And one of them, actually, I wanted to actually witness a supernova in our own galaxy. That's an exploding star. I didn't yet. There hasn't been one. There was one when Galileo was alive. But there hasn't been one in the last, more than 300 years. Well, some people joke and say that that's because there hasn't been a great astronomer in all this time. But there has been one in the Large Magellanic Cloud, which is a neighboring galaxy to ours. So we have seen that. I was hoping that I would actually that we would find life around other stars.
Yeah.
Somewhere. And I've grown old and it still hasn't happened. So I still have some hope, but not a lot of hope. I still think this will happen within the next 20 to 30 years, that either we will find life, not necessarily intelligent life, but some form of life on planets around other stars within about 20 to 30 years, or that we will be able to place some meaningful constraints on how rare such life is. But, I don't know that I will live 20 to 30 more years. I mean, it would be a stretch. So I'm afraid that I may not actually see that. But that would be great if I actually will get to see this still during my lifetime. I must say that inequality is something that I truly worry about. There are things that I don't worry about, which other people worry about. Things like, for example, it is possible that biological life is only a short phase in the evolution of civilizations, and we would actually move to, some form of AI, of artificial intelligence, which will take over. I'm not worried about that. It's the same type of evolution that has happened until now, and if it happens, it happens, and it doesn't mean that these things are going to be enemies of biological life. They will probably live at least for some time, together. So that doesn't worry me that much. But I think it will happen. I'm one of those who thinks that it is very possible that biological intelligence, biological civilizations, as we know them, are only a relatively short-lived phase in the evolution of civilizations.
It's interesting how you've touched on so many topics that I think have been relevant, especially on Talk Nerdy recently. Like Kevin Hand was recently on the show talking about astrobiology and about the search for life in other worlds, especially maybe some of the icy moons of our own solar system. And I've been, more and more focused on social inequity and social justice on the show ever since I've decided to go back for my PhD in psychology. And so it's really cool to see that some of these same, concerns and issues are relevant in the mind of an astrophysicist as they are in the mind of maybe a social psychologist, that really ultimately we are all kind of on this rock together trying to solve some of the same problems and hopefully in doing so, just improve the lives of all of us who are living together on the globe. So I don't know. I was pleasantly surprised by some of your answers to those questions.
Of course, I did mention things that are obvious. I mean, climate change is clear.
Right. That's what everybody says, but it's true. There's a reason for it.
It's a very serious problem. It's a very, very serious problem. I cannot tell you how much I admire this, young girl, Greta Thunberg.
Yes.
I think she's just incredible. And she, at age 17, understands more than some of these much older and supposedly much wiser people, on Earth. So I think she's amazing. I have a small prediction that maybe she will get the next Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah. Yeah, I could definitely see that. And I think it's interesting that even though your book is about science denial, I mean, obviously the climate change conversation is so important. It obviously wasn't terribly relevant during Galileo's day, but now these same themes pop up. And even one of the blurbs on your book, one of the comments that was made on your book that's promoted by your publisher is by Bill McKibben, because it's fundamentally important from that perspective, from an ecological perspective, this idea of listening to science and promoting scientific thought and making evidence-based policy decisions, which we, as we know, at least in our country, and if not in many parts of the world, have historically not been very good about doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I was very gratified when Bill McKibben said, what he said. And, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, guys, the book is Galileo and the Science Deniers by Dr. Mario Livio. Mario, thank you so much for joining me on the show. It's always a pleasure when I have the chance to talk to you.
My pleasure, Cara. It was really a very good conversation.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.